Welcome, everyone. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. Welcome to today's Friday lecture with Professor Andrés Reséndez. Thank you, those of you who are joining us through the YouTube live stream for this quarter's. Actually, this is the last weekly lecture of this quarter. Kindly note that because it is a webinar, it is being live streamed, but it will also be available for the public after the event. If you are watching through our YouTube channel, please kindly submit your questions or comments through the chat, and I will make sure I read those to Professor Reséndez during the Q&A session at the end of the talk. I do want to remind us all that for those of us who are here at Stanford, we're in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, to the water, and to the air that surround us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone and Lenape peoples, who continue to be present in their homelands, in this unceded territory, and throughout their diasporas. For those who are at UC Davis, the university stands on the land that has been the home of the Patwin people for thousands of years. Today, there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Kachil Dehe Band of Wintun Indians, of the Colusa Indian community, the Quetzal Dehe Wintun Nation, and the Yocha Dehe Wintun Nation. It's for me a really great pleasure to have Andrés Reséndez here with us. He is professor of history and an author who grew up in Mexico. We kind of grew together in some way. We have been friends for many years. He currently teaches at the University of California, Davis. His specialties are the early European exploration and the colonization of the Americas. He's also written extensively on the U.S.-Mexico border and the early history of the Pacific Ocean. His immediately previous book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, is an incredibly important book for those of us who want to understand deep origins of the kind of questions of racism, inequality, exclusion in Latin America today. It was a finalist of the 2016 National Book Award, and he was the winner of the 2017 Bancroft Prize from Columbian University. I should also mention, it's not in my notes, but his book on Cabeza de Vaca is an incredible page turner. It's a novel. That's an earlier book. But his latest book, which we're going to be hearing about today, is called Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery, which was released in September of last year. So Andrés, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to present on this project that has really grabbed me for the past 7 years. So let me start out by trying to point out that we know from childhood that the early modern world at least began with a Genoese mariner who crossed the Atlantic in 1492. But we know precious little about the Pacific, the area where we live, the coast where we live. And if we were to ask people how it all began, how that great ocean that is roughly twice as large as the Atlantic began, people would be hard pressed to come up with an answer. So that's the story that I was very intrigued by in this final in this final book that Beto was mentioning. And the answer is multi-stage. So this is a story that began with Polynesian sailors, as you know, by island hopping. They were able to cross the entire length of this enormous ocean over the course of thousands of years. Around 1,000 years ago, they had reached the Society Islands that you can see right there in your map in the middle. And just last year, there was some exciting.
Andrés, sorry, we're not seeing a screen shared. Okay. I guess you're assuming we have a screen.
Okay. Oh boy. I don't have a screen share icon on my end somehow. Let me see.
Okay, all panelists.
Andres, if you press the escape button,
What's
or
that?
maybe the yellow minimize button, it should give you the option to exit your PowerPoint and start sharing again from Zoom.
Okay, let me see. Okay, so let me
I think all
share screen.
panelists.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Okay.
I think I got it now. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Excellent.
Okay, sorry.
So show us the first slide if you can, just quickly.
So that's the beginning. So Conquering the Pacific, the title. So as I was saying, the Pacific is twice as large. We know very little about how these ocean was bridged. And as I was saying, it's a multi-stage story that began with Polynesians. As you can see here in the middle of the screen, about 1,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators arrived in the Society Islands. And just last year, we got really exciting DNA evidence showing that there is a mixture between Polynesians and Native American DNA harking back to the 12th or 13th century, so prior to the Columbian voyage. Which suggests that there was contact by then. But these early trans-Pacific contact was not durable, and really the permanent contact across the Pacific would occur later on. We know that in the course of his celebrated circumnavigation voyage, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor in the employ of the Spanish crown, was the first to go from the tip of South America. I mean, he was the first to cross the Magellanic Strait and then go across all the way through Guam through the island of Guam and into the Philippines and the Spice Islands. But Magellan really didn't finish the job. He was able to go from the Americas to Asia, but it would be very hard to come back. So the Spanish crown over the next 4 decades. So the Magellan happened in 1519 when this crossing occurred. Over the next 4 decades, the Spanish crown would try to open these great trade route linking Asia and the Americas, and it was not easy. The expedition planners learned 3 basic lessons at that point. So one was that it was possible to go from the Americas to Asia, aided by favorable winds and currents. This is a wind map that I'm showing you here, and I don't know if you can see very, very well with the little arrows, but there were favorable winds and currents above and below the equator. So it was possible to go relatively easy from the Americas to Asia. They also learned that it was extremely difficult to go all the way from Spain to Asia. So the best course of action was to actually establish a port on the western coast of America, in this case, in the coast of Mexico, as a point of departure for these trans-Pacific voyages, as you would imagine, much easier than going all the way from Spain. But the third lesson was that it was very difficult to come back. Once these fleets had gone from the Americas to Asia, they found that there was no return. And during those 4 decades, I mean, I'm showing you a couple of voyages that went from the Americas to the Philippines, from Mexico to the Philippines, but these are their tracks in returning. As you can see, these are the no less than 7 expeditions in which the Spanish tried to find a way back, the so-called vuelta or volta in Portuguese, to try to return from Asia to America across the Pacific Ocean. And this problem began with Magellan, as you can see at the top of the screen. Magellan's expedition, Magellan himself died in the Philippines, as many of you know. but his crew were the first to try to return across the Great Ocean, and they failed. That's the track in 1522, and subsequent Spanish expeditions failed to return to find the Vuelta, and that was the last piece of the puzzle to open trade between the Americas and Asia, a trade that we can talk later about. It has been absolutely central to the history of humanity, and it is very important to us today now that the geopolitical center has shifted in some ways from the European and Atlantic theater of operations to the Pacific. Okay, so the expedition that I wanted to cover in this book that fascinated me from the very beginning for reasons that will become obvious took place in the aftermath of these 7 failed attempts. It is an expedition that was sponsored from the highest levels. So on the left-hand side, you have Philip II, the Emperor of Spain, sometimes known as the Prudent King, because Spain attained its greatest imperial size and its greatest might during his long reign. But as Jeffrey Parker, one of his most recent biographers, has pointed out, he was anything but prudent. In fact, he calls it the imprudent king because he was fond of actually backing pretty crazy schemes. He was, for example, the one who sent the so-called Invisible Armada to defeat the British with disastrous consequences. And he also became quite interested in finding this new route to the ocean. So remember, this is a moment of history in which Portugal was reaping the benefits of trading with Asia alone. Portugal had gone the other way around the world, so that is rounding Africa and India all the way to the Far East, where it was trading precious spices and ceramics from China and silk, etc. And Spain was interested in cutting into Spanish lead, and for that it needed to pioneer a different route through the other side of the world. And so the Spanish Empire was in control of the American colonies, and it now faced this enormous ocean, and it needed to find a way to return from America, from Asia. And so this is very much what really motivated Spain to really try to put together an incredible expedition. So this is a no expenses spared kind of expedition. It was also a secret expedition because Spain did not want to alert Portugal about its latest attempt. This is in the 1560s. To figure out a way to go and return across the Pacific. So basically, Philip II wrote a blank check, but the person who more specifically had to put together the expedition was the man on the right-hand side on your screen, Don Luis de Velasco, who was the Viceroy of Mexico, a man who had no nautical experience, as far as I can tell. He may not even have ever seen the Pacific Ocean, but he was a very gregarious man, and he very quickly gathered a number of map makers and nautical experts, etc., and put together this expedition. And he really went out of his way. I mean, he didn't spare money. He didn't spare anything to try to put together the best expedition imaginable. He gathered the best pilots available, not only in Mexico, but throughout the Spanish Empire and indeed around the world. He commissioned some of the largest ships ever built, probably the largest ships ever built in the Americas at that time. Just to give you a sense, the Columbian ships, for example, were less than 100 tons burden. Magellan's circumnavigation largest ship was 120. The ships that he commissioned to be built were 400 and 500 tons of burden. So, 3-4 times larger than the previous, than these vessels. So clearly a quantum leap ahead. So it was a very exciting technological enterprise. It was a very exciting human enterprise in the sense that they really went out of the way to find the best pilots. And it was also a secret expedition, as I mentioned. So the most established port on the Mexican coast in the early to mid 19th century was Acapulco, as you can see in the map down there, a very spacious bay and very easy for ships to navigate in and out of. And this would have been the most logical choice, but it would have been one where Portugal would know exactly what was going on. So instead of establishing these shipyards and building this fleet in Acapulco, they chose Barra de Navidad, as it is called now, or the Puerto de Navidad, as it was called back then, far to the north of Acapulco, as you can see there. It was a really surprising and daring choice because at the time, in the 1550s, for example, this is a map of Nueva Galicia, which is that particular coast where Navidad was located. It had been the site of a major indigenous uprising. So you can see at the top left of your screen, nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, arms with bows and arrows, taking prisoners and torturing them, cutting them with knives, etc. So it had been a site of great turmoil. And if you can see on your right-hand side, you can see a little bay with 2 little islands. Let me give you a close-up of that. So you can see, let me just go back so you can see where it is relative to the rest of the coast. And if you can read the Spanish gloss, it says Puerto de la Navidad, which is exactly where this expedition departed from. This is what it looks like today. Still, you can see a little island in the middle. So it's a lagoon with a couple of islands in the middle. There's a narrowing of the lagoon that goes into a horseshoe bay, as you can see, and that's where the expedition departed from. Indeed, if you see kind of in the middle of your screen, you can see there's a marina there with some sailboats and powerboats there even today. So 4 ships departed from these site in 1564, in the fall of 1564, with the intention of going to the Philippines and finding a way back, finding the vuelta finally after so many failures. With the largest ships ever built in the Americas, quite likely up to that time, and with some of the best pilots from the Spanish Empire. As I said, no expenses spared. The guiding spirit of this expedition was this interesting figure, a mariner, somebody who had participated very early on in the exploration of the Pacific. He had been an apprentice, not to Magellan, because as I said, Magellan died in the Philippines, but the man who had completed the circumnavigation voyage, a Spaniard from northern Spain, from the Basque Country, named Sebastián del Cano. He was the one who completed the circumnavigation voyage, and Andrés de Urdaneta was also from the Basque Country, from a town neighboring that of Sebastián del Cano, and so he became del Cano's apprentice, and that's how he began his interest in exploration and his interest in the Pacific, more specifically. So in the aftermath of that pioneering circumnavigation expedition, del Cano was approached by the Spanish crown to do a second circumnavigation, and Elcano accepted and took his apprentice Urdaneta on that voyage. It would turn out to be a disastrous 9-year expedition. This is the second circumnavigation of the world. But Urdaneta, Elcano perished in that attempt, but Urdaneta had survived. He had learned some of the languages spoken in Southeast Asia. He had seen the weather patterns with his own eyes during that time. He had even fathered a child there. He had formed a family, and so he became one of the foremost expeditionaries of the Pacific of the time in the 1520s and 30s and 40s. But eventually, life went on, and he decided to change his activities. He joined an Augustinian convent, and it was only the insistence of the Spanish king that ended up plucking him out of his quiet retreat in this Augustinian convent in Mexico City and ordering him directly to participate in this trans-Pacific attempt to find the Vuelta. So he was the person who was reputed to be the most knowledgeable about the Pacific, had done it with 40 years earlier, and knew a lot about Southeast Asia and the weather patterns there. There was a second protagonist to this story who is a rather interesting one. He was an Afro-Portuguese mariner who is the protagonist of my book. Lopez Martinez is his name. He had cut his teeth in southern Portugal in going aboard some of the ships of exploration, both of the Portuguese and the Spanish. So the Algarve is the name of this area in southern Portugal, was at the time in the early 16th century the preeminent maritime region in the world. And so that's and people of African origins, some of them slaves and some of them not slaves. So Lopez Martin was not a slave. He was described as a mulatto man, but clearly his ancestors had been enslaved and in southern Portugal. So he rose through the ranks until becoming a licensed pilot, the highest occupation that somebody like Lopez Martin could ever aspire to. And so he was the one. He was another pilot, another key pilot, and indeed, as I will tell you later on, he was the man who finally did it. He's the Columbus of the Pacific, so to speak, who was the first to go from America to Asia and back. So these motley crew, these four large ships, were the ones who first crossed the Pacific. I don't have too much time to go through the details, but it was just it's a difficult undertaking, as you can imagine. Nearly 2 months without the sight of land. As I said, the Pacific is twice as large as the Atlantic. Very little was known about the Pacific at the time. And after 6 weeks of not seeing any land, these pilots started seeing little islands that emerged out of nowhere. So we see, if you look in the Spanish archives, you can see some of the drawings of the pilots of this expedition of these little islands. The dots on the right are coral reefs that made these islands extraordinarily dangerous, because if your ship hit those corals, it could create leaks and it could be deadly. And these islands were very small. They were right in the middle of the ocean, and there was very little other than palm trees, and some of them had fresh water, but some of them did not. They also reported atolls, a very characteristic type of formation to the Pacific. And again, we see some of these early pilots sketching these, what they described as lagoons in the middle of the ocean, or corrals. They sometimes describe them as corrals in the middle of the ocean. So they were shallow waters teeming with fish, extraordinarily tempting to stop. You can imagine after 6 weeks without the sight of land, you really wanted to drop anchor and go there, do fish, go around, walk around on dry land for a change. But getting there was extremely difficult. It was extremely dangerous. And so typically ships avoided these very small atolls and islands. And that's where they also began to see Micronesians, the original inhabitants of these little islands and atolls, and commented on their extraordinary seamanship. And again, I don't have too much time to talk about these early interactions, but we'll be happy to do that over the course of questions and answers if you have any inclination to learn about that. These 4 ships were supposed to go in a convoy. They were supposed to go together, and they had clear signals in case they needed to, if, for example, of course, I mean, this is happening in an era where there were no GPS, and there was no radio communication. So losing the sight of one ship from another was something common in 16th century expeditions. And this is exactly what happened in this particular expedition. There was a storm, and the smallest of the 4 ships, the San Lucas, became separated from the rest of the squadron, from the other 3 ships under the. So the smallest of the 4 ships, piloted by Lopez Martinez, this extraordinary Afro-Portuguese pilot, essentially continued on its original course, while the rest of the ships decided to veer north because they knew about the island of Guam. The island of Guam had been visited by Magellan, and so they knew the latitude of that island. And so after weeks and weeks of not seeing land, they decided that they wanted to stop there for a little while. This is the bay in Guam where these ships, landed. Again, I don't have too much time to go through the details, but there they found the native inhabitants of Guam that the Spanish called the Chamorros. I'm sorry, and who were so eager to trade, especially for metal. They were eager to trade coconuts, fish, rice that they had, etc., for metals, especially metal nails, etc., etc. And so that's how these initially unified expedition became a little bit of a race between the San Lucas that remained isolated and the other 3 ships with the bulk of the resources, the maps, etc. This is a map that shows the trajectories of the two sides of this expedition. The San Lucas, as you can see on the right-hand side, arrived a week earlier than the rest of the Legazpi expedition that you can see at the top right of the screen, arrived on February 13 as opposed to January 29th, and much farther north. The Legazpi squadron touched the Philippine archipelago much farther north. So even though they eventually would spend weeks and weeks exploring these archipelago, and in fact, they came very close to reuniting around April of 1565. In fact, they were not able to reunite. And so this is how the San Lucas on its own, as I said, the smallest of the 4 ships, faced this terrible dilemma of having to either continue searching for the rest of the fleet and continue to deplete its provisions, or it could defect to the Portuguese. Remember, this is the Philippine archipelago, which is not too far from the Spice Islands, where the Portuguese had already entrenched themselves and they had established forts. So it was possible to just sail to the Spice Islands and defect to the Portuguese, or follow with the original instructions and tried to find the return voyage, the Vuelta, that had never been done before. The reason why the Vuelta was so difficult has to do with the patterns of winds and currents in the Pacific. And again, I don't have too much time to explain that, but again, I'd be happy to expand in questions and answers. But it had to do with the so-called gyres. So there are 5 enormous circular wheels of wind and currents in the world, 2 of them on the Atlantic side, 2 of them in the Pacific, and 1 in the Indian Ocean, as you can see there. And so basically, so you can see from, if you look at the middle of your screen into the North Pacific Gyre, you can see that why it was relatively easy to go from the coast of Mexico to the Philippines, because both of them are directly aligned, at 19 or 17 degrees of northern latitude. There's a band of winds and currents that joining the 2 directly. But in order to get back, you really need to sail way to the north of the Philippines, brush up against practically the coast of Japan, and then try to catch the northern rim of the Pacific Gyre back to America, as you can see there. And this is something that European mariners knew a little bit about from their experience with the Atlantic, but there was an additional complication, and that is the monsoon winds. Again, I don't have too much time to go into the details of the monsoon, but the monsoon, let me just go back to the previous one, is something that we typically associate with the Indian Ocean, but in fact, it also spills into the Pacific side. And these are seasonal winds that basically reverse course 180 degrees. And so in order to successfully navigate back to the Americas, you had to not only navigate way north from the Philippines to catch the northern rim of the Pacific Gyre, but you also had to do that at the right time of the year in order to take advantage of the right monsoon winds that would push you in the right direction and take you to a point where you could successfully attempt a return. So this is the route of the San Lucas between April and August of 1565. Again, from the Philippines, as you can see, it went way north. This is the equivalent of going from around the Panama coast all the way to Oregon, to just give you a sense of just how much from south to north they needed to navigate. They needed to catch these complicated winds on the northern rim of the Pacific Gyre, and they needed to keep at it for months. I mean, the return, was really something beyond anything that European explorers had experienced up to that time. Just to give you a sense, return trips. So eventually, this became a yearly route linking Mexico and the Philippines in what became known as the Manila Galleon. Typically, these passages took 4, 5, 6, or 7 months, just to give you a sense of just the endurance and the difficulty of the passage. We know a little bit about the route but very little, because basically after departing from the Philippines, these voyagers would not see sight of land until reaching the Americas, except from one extraordinary pillar of rock that is about 500 miles directly south of Tokyo. So if we go back to the route, you can see how this happened. And so that gives us a sense of their whereabouts. But beyond that, we know only from the logs of the pilots how far north they had gone. And more or less we can figure out how they actually did this return voyage that turned out to be successful in the end. The return voyage was extremely difficult. The pilots and other surviving documentation reports extremely cold conditions, even though it happened, as you can see on your screen, over the summer, spring and summer, April to August. They recorded the coldest summer ever. Some of the sources record even snow. They record how the oil that they took for the lamps froze and had to be taken out in pieces, which seems hard to believe for us, but this is taking place during the Little Ice Age, and this route is taking place just south of the Aleutian Islands, as you can see at the top of your screen, this necklace of islands connecting the peninsula of Kamchatka with Alaska. So it was pretty far north that you had to go, and so they reported a month of storms and cold weather and occasional snow, which was a real problem because in order for you to establish your north-south direction, your latitude, you needed to be able to measure the altitude of the sun at noon. And so if there was a month in which the sun was not visible, then you could not really establish your latitude because you could not do that measurement. They also had other problems. After that month of storms, the weather cleared up, but then there was a plague of rats that affected this expedition. So basically, rats had proliferated in this ship, in the San Lucas, as it happened in all ships of the era, and they became desperate because the only water available after the weather cleared up was in the 8 casks of water that the San Lucas carried. So just to give you a sense, the San Lucas carried a crew of 20 people. And this is a very small voyage where you would be appalled to know just how small it is. This is the equivalent of a private sailing vessel today. And so these 20 men counted on not 8, but 6. They had already depleted 2 of the casks or barrels of water. And the rats became so desperate that they started gnawing on the remaining casks in order to gain access to the water. And in 2 hours, they spilled the contents of 2 additional barrels. So the crew of the San Lucas had to mount 24-hour guards in order to protect the 4 remaining casks of water. They had to put fires during the night in order to see how these rats attacking and trying to gnaw into the barrels. A rather dangerous operation because this could result in the burning down of the entire ship in the middle of the ocean, as it sometimes happened. So it was again a very dramatic passage, and in the end, there was also a near shipwreck, and again, the details of which I can't really go into. I don't have too much time to go into. Right in front of Baja California, as you can see by the trajectory. So they lost their way for a little bit, but they eventually were able to arrive to the coast of Mexico, to Navidad. Oops. And to great acclaim. So after the arrival of Lopez Martinez, he was credited with being the pilot who first, and we know that for a fact, who was first able to launch a successful return across the Pacific. Mexico was going to become the Axis Mundi, the connection between East and West. They were going to divert all of that trade that Portugal was carrying through Africa and India, and now it was going to be done across the Pacific. And so there were all these, great plans for Mexico that was going to remain in the center of the world, and these, to some extent, happened. In the aftermath of these expedition, there were yearly galleons going from Mexico to the Philippines and back, and with tremendous consequences that we seldom appreciate, or we never always appreciate. So this is the project that I'm involved in now, which is what happened in the aftermath of these opening quote unquote of the Pacific, so to speak, which was absolutely momentous. So scholars have really rightfully put emphasis on some of the trade goods that were exchanged. So 80% of all the silver produced in the world between the 1500 and 1800 was produced in the Americas, and China became by far the largest consumer of silver. So that was reshaping everything around the world. But there were other consequences. So, for example, these galleons took to Asia, to the Philippines and to China and to Japan and India, etc., highly productive American crops like corn, peanuts, and sweet potatoes. And in the case of China, these led to a population boom that is seldom recognized. So, for example, in 1500, China already represented about 25% of the world's population. In 1800, after 3 centuries of these regular Manila Galleon exchange, China's population had grown to about 36% of the world's population. So over 1/3 of the world population lived in merely 6% of the world's surface, with consequences that are pretty obvious, as China was able to exert enormous influence over great areas of the world. So I'm afraid that I'm going to stop here just with with this, and leave a few minutes. If you have any questions or comments or anything, I'd be happy to try to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very well.
Yes, so we are here in the seminar room of our Center for Latin American Studies. I will start just by mentioning there's a couple of things. Greetings to you on the YouTube from Michael Wolf, from Scott Rich. But I think we can probably start with a question here in the room. Maybe that's the best way to have. We have like 15 minutes that we can use for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I would like to know if you could speak more about your data collection process, because how you went through historical archives, probably maps as well. I'd be really interesting to hear how you gathered and collected the data to create the story presented in the book.
Sure. Well, thank you. I've known about bits and pieces of this story for over 20 years. Since I began my career as a historian, I've been always very interested in the 16th century. I learned that there was this Afro-Portuguese pilot who had been the first to go across the Pacific and return successfully. And yet, as a payment for his services, the Spanish crown actually sentenced him to be hanged. And so, I mean, that's another part of the story that we didn't even touch here. So I knew that down the line, this was, first of all, I knew very little about the history of the Pacific, so that was one interesting bit. But another one was that I really wanted to get to the bottom of that story of why he would be sentenced to death in spite of the incredible services that he provided to the Spanish crown. And so I began collecting information about the expedition. So there are surviving logbooks of the different pilots. As I said, these pilots were some of the foremost pilots of the era. And they all provided logbooks. Some of them are really boring about, the latitude, longitude, etc. every day, but they also made telling comments about conditions in the in the ship, or interactions with Micronesians or natives from the Philippines, etc. So I collected those, and above all, because this was such a notorious case, because the Afro-Portuguese pilot was considered piratical, again for reasons that we can go into, there were several glosses and commentaries on that. So I'd use some of that also to flesh out the story. But it is a story that it's difficult to piece together. You have to do that in Spain. You have to do it in Mexico. I went to Guam. I went to the Philippines. So it's a story, and it is also an interesting story because typically when you read, if you read the specialized literature on the early opening of the Pacific, you will see Andrés de Urdaneta, the friar mariner that I showed you, credited as the first to actually do this. And the story of Lopez Martinez is usually completely forgotten because of the circumstances of his involvement, and because of his subsequent trial. And so these are the sources that I used to piece together this story to the best possible extent. It's not always possible, but it is also possible because some of the sailing so the sailing challenge has remained largely the same. I mean, conditions are not identical from the 15th century, but the gyres remain the same. The dominant winds and currents remain the same. And so you can very well imagine what the formidable obstacle and challenge it was. So again, that's all of those elements were I tried to put together for the story. So thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Can I just follow up before I go to one question in the YouTube? You seem to have this thing about finding Lope de Martin, or in your previous book on Cabeza de Vaca, you have Estebanico, no, who's an African slave who really is, again, the protagonist in your story. They wouldn't have survived had it not been for him. So do you think these African men were unique, or it's just that there were more of them, we just don't know anything about them?
Right. I mean, both of them are pretty parallel stories, as you point out, Alberto. I think they have been simply erased from the story, from the history. Afro-Portuguese mariners existed. Obviously, the life of the sea was very harsh, so it required it required new recruits all the time to work as deckhands, and many people of African descent participated in that. Were naturally drawn to this harsh life of the sea, this super hyper exploitative world. And out of that world, in southern Portugal and southern Spain, there came a few mulatto pilots. So they, to become a pilot, and let me just give you a little bit more context, you really needed to pass some really difficult exams. You needed to demonstrate proficiency in the use of maps. You needed to demonstrate ability to establish your latitudes, that is north-south distance, by measuring the altitude of the sun at noon, as I was pointing out. And some of them became extraordinary at that, including Lopez Martin. So while Lopez Martin was not the only one, they were relatively rare because at the time in the 16th century, most officers and high-ranking individuals and pilots as well tended to be white European men. And these colored pilots and colored mariners were kind of relegated to obscurity. And this has been very much the case with Lopez Martin, and this was certainly the case with Estebanico, who, as you point out, in the earlier Cabeza de Vaca expedition, he was the man serving as intermediary between Native Americans and Europeans, and yet he was not giving his due credit in the aftermath of that expedition. So yeah, I think it's a combination. I think these figures are coming out because we are finally understanding more broadly the different characters that participated in these expeditions, and some of them turn out to be people of African descent.
So thank you. We have a question for Michael Wolf. It's actually two questions in a way. He asks a little bit about what you were saying about climate, whether the ENSO, the Niño, has affected navigation across the Pacific after 1500. But also he has a question of whether you know if any of the Iberian mariners, they knew about China's great mariner of the early 1400s who had crossed the Indian Ocean to East Africa on a trade and tribute mission. So whether you had some evidence about that.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Mikael, for the questions. So first of all, absolutely. While I mentioned that, of course, the gyres and the El Nino phenomena has remained the same or changed. Obviously, they have changed over time, and we know that from the Manila Galleon itself. So for example, we know that at the beginning in the 16th century, when this Manila Galleon was first established, going from Acapulco to Manila took around 3 to 4 months. But as during the 17th century, so a century into this, we know that the voyages started becoming slower, especially on the last leg of the voyage. And we know that was due not to, larger vessels or anything that had to do with the design of the vessels, but it had to do with large-scale weathered patterns. And so instead of taking 3 to 4 months, it took 5 or even 6 months to get from Acapulco to Manila because of these changing weather patterns. And then later on in the 18th century, it shrunk again. The time shrunk again back to 3 or 4 months. So there are some beautiful studies about that that suggest that there were some variation. But the basic challenge, the basic areas where you needed to navigate in order to go from the Americas to Asia and return remain more or less the same, even though the conditions varied from year to year and from century to century. As to exactly what the European mariners of the 16th century knew about local sailors is something that that is difficult to know for sure. And again, this is a key question in the book that I wrote, because as I very briefly alluded to, the key to a successful return was the ability to understand the monsoon winds, and and that you could only get from local mariners, and so we don't really know exactly how these 1564-65 pilots obtained this information. I mentioned that Andrés de Urdaneta had lived in the region for 8 months. He had been stranded in the aftermath of the Magellan expedition. And so he must have talked to pilots in the area, and he must have seen firsthand these dramatic 180-degree change in the direction of the wind, a seasonal wind. And so he would have been a person who would have known about it. But most European sailors and pilots trained in Europe or the Americas would know precious little about the monsoon, other than by talking to somebody like Urdaneta or probably talking to some local mariners. How much they knew about the great expeditions of the 15th century of the Chinese, again, is something that I know precious little about. I don't have any information about that, but it is possible.
So I'll go back to the room in a second, but we have another question from one of our faculty, from Thomas O'Keefe. And he asks, how much was the desire of finding La Vuelta really influenced because of the discovery of silver in Potosí and Zacatecas? So what's the direction, from silver to travel or from travel to silver? How does it work?
That's a very interesting question that I'm currently researching. Well, the connection was very close. And again, we don't have too much time, but China had become the worldwide magnet of silver for reasons that did not detain us here. It had to do with the experimentation of China with money. It had experimented with copper. It had experimented with bills. And there had been a colossal financial collapse in the 15th century. And out of the ashes of that collapse, they turned to Chinese government, and the Chinese people turned to silver as the primary means to store wealth and as a medium of exchange. And so China all of a sudden began demanding silver from the rest of the world. China had some silver mines, but they were not enough to supply all China's needs, and so it started sucking the rest of the silver from the world, basically. I mean, I'm overemphasizing this, but that's basically what happened. And initially, some silver came from Japan. Japan in the 1520s made some silver discoveries in Honshu and became the primary supplier of silver to China. But basically, China exhausted Japan, and it needed more. And the largest silver deposits in the world were in the Americas, of course, and they had been developed by European conquistadors in Mexico and Peru, basically. So Mexico and Peru produced about 99% of all the silver in the world, in the Americas, and in turn, 80% of all the silver produced in the world between 1500 and 1800 came from the Americas. So to the bottom line is that some of the leaders of this expedition that finally opened the Pacific in 1564-65 were also early investors in the silver mines of the so-called province of the silver, La Provincia de la Plata, as it was called. It was a province that was south of Mexico City. It was initially developed by Hernán Cortés and some of his followers, and so clearly the desire to take silver to Asia and the knowledge that silver was worth a lot more in China than in anywhere else in the world was part of the calculation into this desire to open trade across the Pacific. So thank you for that really good question.
So Andres, I'm tempted to try to squeeze one more question, but I know you have a hard stop in 2 minutes, right? In
right.
1 minute and a half.
I'll try to be succinct.
So maybe we do try to squeeze in one more question, or maybe we just try to, okay, maybe let's try to make sure that we get you on time. I know you have a hard stop. So I just want to tell everyone we have just listened to Andrés Reséndez. And this is the last public class event in the quarter, but we are coming back in April 1st for our next Friday seminar. So thank you so much for those of you listening, and thank you, Andrés. It's really been a pleasure. I'm looking so much forward to the next book and hear more about these pirate stories that you didn't tell us about. And it's just so fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure being here. And hello to everyone. Bye.